Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to Data Platform Downunder. Once again, I'm your host for this session, and we've got Jamie Johnston talking to us about an introduction to Azure Synapse Analytics. This session is being recorded and will be put up onto the Data Platform Downunder YouTube channel, where you can come back and look at that at any point in time. If you don't already know, and if you haven't already registered, so this coming Saturday, we have Data Saturday ANZ. It's running, if you go to the website and you have a look, don't be confused. It does show 9 p.m. Start time, but that's for UTC. Okay, so we are starting morning in New Zealand and going across the day, across to Perth time in the afternoon, Saturday afternoon. We do have 48 sessions scheduled, so make sure you register, come along and enjoy the fantastic event which is coming up. So with that, I've taken up enough time. We'll hand over to Jamie and he can take us through what Azure Synapse Analytics is all about.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Got my
yes.
AirPods in. They seem to work really well. So let me share my screen and get started here. I can find my teams. There we go. So, well, I'm in Houston, so it's actually about 9:30 Central Time here in Houston at night. So I'm looking forward to talking to you all about Azure Synapse Analytics. So can y'all see my screen okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Just wanted to make sure. So I don't have a lot of slides. It's all going to be demos, but I do have a few just to kind of give you an introduction to what Azure Synapse Analytics is for those of you who might not know, and then just give you an overview, go through demos and show you all the different components of it. And then feel free to ask questions throughout, you don't have to wait to the end or anything like that. So if you have a question, just interrupt me and say, hey, I have a question. I know we're in this virtual format, so or if you're just the type of person that you're like, I don't want to interrupt you, and you're like, I'm polite, there is the raise hand feature. So I'll look at that. And then also I'll try to keep an eye on the chats as well. So, all right, well, let me get started. So Azure Synapse Analytics you might have heard the term data lakehouse. I don't know if Microsoft itself calls it that. I know some people have called it that. So you probably heard, data lake, and now you kind of have this marriage of a data lake and a data warehouse and to this data lake house, right? And so that's kind of where Azure Synapse Analytics comes into play. And so I kind of have this little tagline here, and I think this might have came from Microsoft or something, but it's kind of bringing what Azure Synapse does is it brings together your data integration, your enterprise data warehousing, your big data analytics, all that into one platform, into one product. So kind of what's this vision? You kind of have this kind of on the left here. You guys can't see my mouse, can you? I think is it Control K? It gives me like a little pointer. Y'all can see that, right? Yeah. So yes. You kind of have here on the left. Yeah, I remember that shortcut, Control K. I learned that this year. I was like, oh, this cool laser pointer with everybody being virtual. You kind of on the left, you have this data warehouse, right? It's schema on right. It's cleansed data, it's predefined data structures, easy to query, but oftentimes it's hard to load. You talk about your data warehouse, you start talking in incremental loads and delta loads and all these different things, right? Where because you want this data in this nice structured, predefined star schema, hopefully, structure. So then you have data lake. So data lake, it can support all types of data. You can have real-time data streaming into these data lakes, but often it's kind of hard to query because a lot of times it's just blobs. These data lakes are typically just blob storage. They can have Parquet type files, JSON files, CSVs, all these different things, but they're easy to load. You just dump the files there, dump your data there. and it's what we call schema on read, meaning you dump the data as it is there, and then as you go to read it, you build the schema around it to read it. What Synapse does, and through this data lakehouse, you kind of get the best of both worlds. And so what Azure Synapse Analytics does is it takes this concept of data warehouse and a data lake, combines it into this best of both type of things. And this is speaking from a data standpoint world, right? And that's kind of this idea of a data lakehouse, right? So kind of any kind of data you have, you can bring to it, whether it's structured data, whether it's unstructured data, whether it's real-time streaming data, whatever type of data you might have, whether it's coming off of sensors and IoT sensors, that all can be streamed in to this Azure Synapse Analytics, into the data lake, into the data warehouse, and you get both of these type of technologies in the same environment through Azure Synapse Analytics. And this, what I like, what I don't call, it's not me, I didn't come up with this term. It might have been Databricks that came up with this lakehouse term, but this data lakehouse. So where did Azure Synapse Analytics come from in the Microsoft ecosystem? Where did Microsoft kind of build this Azure Synapse Analytics? Well, Microsoft had this idea of a modern data warehouse concept in Azure. And what it was the idea of using Azure Data Factory, which, if you're not familiar with what Azure Data Factory is, it still is a very big product inside of Azure. But it's your ETL inside of Azure. So it's your enterprise ETL, ELT, however you want to, whatever way you like to do the lettering. It's your data ingestion pipelines to get data into Azure and Azure Data Factory. And so what Microsoft says is, hey, we use this Azure Data Factory to load our data into our Azure SQL Data Warehouse. So that was the precursor of Synapse. So Azure SQL Data Warehouse used to be called the Analytics Platform System, and then before that was Parallel Data Warehouse. That was the on-premise names, and then that moved into the cloud as Azure SQL Data Warehouse. It's a 60-node, massively parallel processing SQL Server engine that supports petabytes and petabytes of scale of data, right? And so you had this Azure SQL Data Warehouse. You had Azure Data Factory bringing that data into that data warehouse. You had Azure Databricks, where you can then use the things like Apache Spark to analyze that data from a machine learning standpoint. You also had the Azure Data Lake Storage, where you could put store data as well, whether that be brought in through Azure Data Factory, or if you're bringing it through like IoT hubs or event hubs, or inside of Azure, store the data lake storage, and then to visualize it, being a Microsoft project, Microsoft products, obviously the slide deck for Microsoft was going to say Power BI, but it's SQL, so you can use any tool that can read SQL, whether it be Tableau, Spotfire, whatever your tool of choice is, Excel for most people. But the idea is Microsoft says, hey, we can take all these tools, the Azure Data Lake Storage, the Azure Data Factory, the Azure Databricks, the Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and take all these tools, put them together, and we're going to call this Azure Modern Data Warehouse. And that's going to be how you create kind of what Synapse has given us now, but this kind of data lakehouse, this environment. The problem you had is these are all separate components from the Azure to manage. And so you would install them, you had to configure them so they all can talk to one another inside of Azure. Not that it was super cumbersome, but you still had to do that. And still to manage them, you went to each one of these resources in Azure to manage them. And so what Microsoft did is it kind of took all of these components here and said, hey, we can build one product out of this called Azure Synapse Analytics. Now, they don't use Databricks for the Spark, the Apache Spark. They use Apache Spark, and they have some of their own code into it, inside of for it. So if you're not familiar with what Databricks, Apache Spark is, Databricks is the company. The founders of Databricks started Apache Spark. It's a high performance analytics engine, built in the Hadoop ecosystem. Databricks built the Apache Spark part of that. They formed a company called Databricks. Azure Databricks is the commercial variant of Apache Spark, which is the open source version. Databricks has like 80% of the code that's in the open source Apache Spark product, but then, the Databricks company puts a little more of their secret sauce into the Azure Databricks. You also have Databricks on GCP and AWS if you're using those clouds. Put a little more extra sauce into that Apache Spark engine in Azure Databricks. But Microsoft, because they needed to build it all on the Synapse Analytics and kind of control the whole ecosystem, they're using the open source version of Apache Spark, but they do add their own code to make it faster. And they have some benchmarks where they can show where the Apache Spark they're using inside of Synapse is faster than just the straight open source Apache Spark. So like I said, so going back kind of this little red box, they're kind of taking all these tools and combining that into Azure Synapse. And so you have this whole Azure Synapse Analytics platform, and it takes the concept of the pipelines and the mapping data flows out of Azure Data Factory, using the Azure Data Lake Gen 2 Data Lake, using the Azure, go back a slide, the Azure SQL Data Warehouse. It's now called dedicated SQL Pools inside of Synapse. These type of concepts came out of that Azure Modern Data House, but all into this one product of Azure Synapse Analytics. And then on top of this, you have the Azure Synapse Studio, which I'll demo all this in a second, to as the front end to manage all of these things. Some of these things that say new, what this is meaning is new from this idea of Modern Data Warehouse V1. When they kind of took all the different components of all of this, combined into Synapse, they added some extra stuff. So they added some support, Spark tables. They added these SQL on-demand pools. And the SQL on-demand pool uses Polybase behind the scenes. So if you're familiar with the Polybase technology that's been in SQL Server and the Azure SQL Data Warehouse to read and write data super fast, the SQL on-demand pools uses this Polybase format to read data in the data lake, to read this, it uses also this SQL on-demand pools can read Spark tables. And they also have this idea of, they have this thing called Synapse links, where they're building these, they call them, I think, HTAP, this hybrid transactional and analytic processing, I think is what it stands for, these links so that you can connect straight through these on-demand pools to like Cosmos DB. They also have links to Azure SQL Database so that you can connect straight to your transactional systems, but analyze them in cache formats inside of the Azure Synapse Analytics using the SQL on-demand pools. And then, like I said, they have the Apache Spark pools. This in the V1 of the Modern Data Warehouse was this Azure Databricks, which was the commercial variant of Apache Spark. They're using the open source Apache Spark. And like I said, they're adding their own little secret sauce to it as well to make it faster. They just released 3.x support for Apache Spark in Azure Synapse. So for those of you that are familiar with Apache Spark and have been waiting, and may have read up a little bit on Synapse, and been waiting for the 3.0 version of Apache Spark, that is available now in Synapse Analytics. And so this gives you the things like Spark SQL, Python, PySpark, Scala. They actually have C# support through .NET and do the Apache Spark. And then the whole idea of this visualizing it through Power BI. And so one thing to note about that, there are some connectors and caching and things that they're doing and integration into Synapse into Power BI because it's a Microsoft product to make that easier. But that being said, this whole compute layer, it's all based on SQL and T-SQL, right? And so you don't need Power BI to read your data as it sits in the SQL Data Warehouse or the SQL on-demand pools. They're all exposed as if it's SQL Server. And so in T-SQL, so you can actually use any tool that can read, Azure SQL Database can read the data in Synapse Analytics in these SQL provision pools and on-demand pools. So, and then finally, just one little thing. I'm not going to talk about Purview today, but I wanted to mention it because if you're familiar with the Azure Data Catalog, this is what Azure Data Catalog became Purview, but a lot more. So it's not only is it a catalog, they're going to do things around, managing your data and governance and all that. But one of the reason why I mentioned this is one of the things that Microsoft's really big in their whole story of around Synapse and Purview and the integration of all that is you can use Purview to go and discover the data in your organization and have it catalog it and have it do all the metadata and all the different things around it. And then with inside of Synapse and like in the studio, you can connect to this Purview and then you can discover and manage, and view and use your data inside of Azure Synapse connected to Purview. And so this whole kind of idea is the Azure Synapse analytics becomes your data platform to do all kinds of data, whether it's structured or unstructured. But then the Purview plugs in and connects right into the Synapse for your data catalog, so that you can then discover and use that data inside of Synapse. And then Azure Marketing slide 1, Azure Marketing slide 2. I was just putting those in for fun. I was going through my slide decks I had, and this is one that I had from Microsoft. But I kind of talked about all this already, but I just put them using the slide deck, just so if you wanted to see some stuff there. But the idea here, and I kind of put this slide here, is your on-premise data, your cloud data, your other data sources, your streaming data. This all can be brought into Synapse, right? And it can be landed in the data lake storage. It can be landed in the SQL pools, like the dedicated SQL pools. You have these Azure Synapse leaks. This slide's a little old. I think SQL Server is Azure SQL supported now. This is Cosmos. You have these Synapse links that can connect to these transactional type of systems. And then on the other side, you can do Azure Machine Learning, Power BI, all this to look and use that data as it sits in Synapse. And that's it for slides. So any questions so far?
Everybody's quiet.
All right.
Hey, yeah, well, it's Greg, I suppose, the last one. Look, one of the things I see all the time that has me completely curious is in many cases, they start with strongly structured data. I see people pull it out into basically unstructured files and throw it in a data lake, and then they're going to load it up again into a strongly typed store. Just conceptually, I mean, that feels like 1980. It doesn't feel like modern, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And as a concept, that seems like a really dodgy concept, because every time you go through some other way of storing the data, you just have a chance of losing integrity and so on.
Yeah, and that's actually, that's actually part of the story around Synapse. Let me bring the slides up real quick again. It should be right here. So if I come back here, that's kind of part of the story here around, these on-demand pools. I mean, there is the idea and the support. Whereas you have some of this unstructured data that you're landing in these on-demand pools, you can use the Polybase, the T-SQL support, and create views to that data on demand pools and never actually have to load it in the data warehouse. But it just depends on the performance and what you're trying to do and how your data is, right? You're not going to get the performance you get out of an Azure SQL data warehouse using the on-demand pools, even though they've got caching structures and things around that. But you're just not going to get the same type of performance necessarily that you're going to get out of the SQL provision pools, what they call dedicated SQL pools now.
Yeah. No, I get that end. It's more just I see people building data lakes now, and they seem to start with databases, pull the data out and stick it in files, only to then try and decipher the files back into strongly structured data.
So there's two reasons to do that. So I do that actually. So and I'll tell you why I do it. And this is so I have data sources that are databases. In this case, this is SAP data sitting in a HANA database. I actually pull them into Parquet files in the data lake, and then in those Parquet files, they're actually loaded via Polybase into the SQL data warehouse. And I do it for two reasons. One, because I need to have it in the data lake to load it via Polybase for the performance. It loads much faster. Now you can stage it. You don't actually have to physically dump it into the Parquet file. You can actually, and I'll show you this when I demo in a second. I'll show you where you can just clue the staging, and it can go from your SQL source, stage it into a data lake for you, automatically staging it temporarily, and then it'll load it via Polybase into the SQL data warehouse, which is super fast. But the reason why I permanently store it as the Parquet file, because I have it so that I can go and use things like Apache Spark Pools and Databricks against those Parquet files, which sometimes have much better performance against the Parquet files whenever I do certain operations that have been optimized for that, right? And certain algorithms that I'm using inside of Apache Spark. So that's why.
Yeah, so I get the rationale if you're determined to use Spark. Yep.
Correct. Now, why some people are just like, hey, I'm going to pull out on my relational database, dump it as files, and then from files load it in my thing. That doesn't necessarily make sense if you're not going to do anything with Spark. But in my case, that's why I do it. And so, does that answer your question, Greg? But
yeah,
I mean, I guess it wasn't
no problem. Thanks.
It's just as much a question as a comment, and I know exactly what you're talking about, right? And for some, I think for some, it's just they get lost in the technology, right? And if they're not using Spark,
what has me chuckling is I was at a site a couple of years ago, and they were moving data from SQL Server to SQL Server, but they were doing it through BizTalk, right? Because that was sensible. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's what they knew, probably, right? And sometimes that's just what you know, right? So, like, if you're a person, that's what they know, that's what they do, right? And so sometimes it's hard to teach somebody a new trick, right? But yeah, no, I totally get your question.
All good.
All right, cool. All right, so just real quick, let me go back. Actually, I said I'm gonna do this one thing right here, just because I want to show you one thing and kind of talk about what I'm gonna demo. So I'm gonna demo the pipelines. I'm gonna demo the Studio. I'm gonna demo the relational database data warehouse, the data lake, Spark tables. I'm not going to demo Cosmos and T-SQL Synapse links because I don't have that kind of money to spin up a Cosmos DB and play with it. But that exists. I'm going to demo the SQL OnDemand pools. I'm going to demo, like I said, provisioning, data warehouse. I'm going to demo the Apache Spark pools, demo Power BI, kind of show you how you can bring data into these various components inside of Azure Synapse Analytics and consume them. And in this case, we'll use Power BI to consume them. We'll also use the Azure Synapse Studio, and we'll also use SQL Server Management Studio. So that sounds like a plan you guys are signed up for. So let me do this first. I've already have Synapse installed and set up. So I'm going to go in and just show you a few things already set up, and then I'm going to walk you through how I set them all up so that you can see it done, right? So when you get inside of Synapse, so when you go to portal.azure.com and you create Workspace and you type Synapse and you click Azure Synapse Analytics. Let me do one thing real quick. Let me get Zoom it open. So when you type Synapse Analytics, and you select this one, Azure Synapse Analytics, you can create your Synapse Analytics environment. So I have my subscription. In this case, I select my resource group. It creates this managed resource group. And what this does is it kind of holds all the ancillary stuff that gets created behind the scenes. And it'll kind of automatically create that for you. If you have a need to control what that does, you can, create your own name there. It's optional. But create your resource group. And then this becomes your Synapse Workspace names. So if I say Synapse Downunder, pick your region, and you notice it doesn't like upper cases, all lower cases, and you see all the rules right there, right? So Workspace may not remain on demand. Why? Because it's going to create something called this dash on demand, which is the on demand SQL pool. So here's an important thing. When you create the Azure Synapse Analytics Workspace, it's going to be attached to a data lake Gen 2 storage. you can use an existing one, or you can have it create one for you new right here. So I've already created this one. I already have it set up. I don't want to use this one, but you give it the account for, if you want to use an existing one, you select it, you give it the file system name where you want to put it. And then one thing to note, this is very important. So when you create Azure Synapse Analytics, it's going to create this enterprise application managed identity that it uses to for access control across everything. If you connect to an existing data lake storage Gen 2 account, you have to go and do some steps to grant access for this to work. So whenever it creates Azure Synapse Analytics, it's going to create this workspace identity. It's got the same name as your workspace right here. You have to make sure that workspace identity has been granted storage blob contributor role to your existing storage account. You have to then, all users that want to use the Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, you have to grant them contributor role inside of Azure. And then the other thing is Synapse uses these Synapse role-based access controls. So inside of Azure, you have some role-based access controls. And then inside of Synapse, it has its own role-based access controls. I'll show you that in the workspace. And so what this is saying, these two lines here is when you create this workspace, when you want to grant people access to use the Azure Synapse Workspace, you have to make sure they're a contributor at least into this workspace inside of Azure. And then you have to go inside of the Synapse Studio and grant them the appropriate Synapse role that you want to give that user so that they can use the Synapse resources inside of Synapse. And then the other thing to do is if you're going to use the storage blob, you have to make sure that the users that want to be able to read and write data inside that storage blob, inside that storage data lake, they've been granted storage blob data contributor to that data lake that you're going to use. So, but when you create it new and you do it this way, it will take care of those grants for you. So like when you're creating it, if you say new and I say like JBJ, Syn, data lake, Downunder, and I just say create new and I create Synapse, whatever you want to call it, right? I don't know if there's specifically a naming standard around there or not. And then you can say right here, it'll say assign myself the storage blob contributor role in the data lake so that you can do it. So this is kind of doing the grants for you. And so this will create your Synapse. And then down here in security, you can enter your password for your SQL admin user. So this is going to be, and you can also rename this if you want to give it a different name. So this is going to be the admin user for the OnDemand SQL Pools. So this is not the Azure SQL Data Warehouse. This is the OnDemand. Actually, I think it ends up being the Azure SQL Data Warehouse too. No, this is just the OnDemand Pools. So you can give it a password, confirm it. There's some options here like this, allow pipelines. So what this does is this will automatically assign that workspace identity at that identity that gets created when you create the Synapse Workspace. It'll allow it to access the SQL pool so the pipelines can read and write. If you're like in the bank, you want to do double encryption using a custom managed key, you can click that and do it there. And then under networking, if you want to do managed virtual networks, so if you want to do private endpoints, you can click that there, and then you can select how secure you want it to be. So if you say yes under this outbound data traffic, this is pretty much, it's all within inside that managed virtual network. So this is like banks and things like that do that. If you're like, hey, I don't care, I want the whole world to see it, which in my case is what I'm doing right now for the demo. You can allow connections from all IP addresses. Don't recommend that, right, for your business. But for this demo, I'm going to just click allow connections. I'm actually not going to create this workspace because I already created it. And then you can create some tags, review and create, and then click create. It's going to go out and create that workspace. I'm not going to actually go through actually creating it because I've already created one right here. So once it's done, you get this Azure you get this workspace. This is the one I created at about 6 this morning, and then I built all the demos out on it today. So you get the Synapse workspace here. One thing I want to show you is, if you remember, I told you once it creates this workspace, it's going to create this managed identity that has the same name. So if anytime you can't see what I have on the screen, let me know. So you can see here's this enterprise application that has the same name as my workspace that's gotten created. Hold on, let me go back. And so this is what Synapse is using to kind of this managed identity, what it'll use internally to connect its resources inside of Synapse. Because when you go and look, if I look at the Synapse, you can have Apache Spark pools, you can have dedicated SQL pools, you can have the serverless SQL endpoints. So this is the on-demand. So what this is right here, these are your connections. Now this connection here, this is your serverless SQL endpoint. So this is that poly-based technology that allows you to do SQL queries against your data as it sits in that data lake, right? Or as it sits in Spark tables. You also have your dedicated SQL endpoint. This is the SQL, what they call the dedicated SQL, used to be called Azure SQL Data Warehouse. So this is that MPP, 60 node, Azure SQL Data Warehouse. That's the connection for that. You can also see, like, here's the ADLS connection. This is the data lake that my Azure Synapse is connected to right here. There's my SQL admin user, also information right here. One thing to point out, if you remember earlier when we were setting up the Synapse Analytics, I talked about Azure role-based security versus Synapse. This is the Azure security. And so if you look at role assignments and roles, this is where you'd want to make sure you granted people who needed to access it contributor roles. So you go here, grant them contributor. I created this, I'm the owner, so I have full access. SQL Active Directory admin. So for those of you who are SQL Server people, this is where you can assign a user or a group to be, SQL admins to the SQL pools using the AD there. You also have your SQL pools, Spark pools, all this information. And this is on the Azure side, right? So this is the dedicated SQL pools, and you also have the built-in. So the built-in, this is that on-demand pool. This is the one that's using the Polybase to read your data as it sits in the data lake, using Polybase, using SQL syntax. You get one of these. This built-in, it's just one. It can auto scale. So just from a pricing standpoint, it's $5 terabyte or gigabyte. I can't remember. It says it when I can't remember, but when you create the thing and you go through next, create your Synapse Workspace, it'll tell you, I think it's $5 a gigabyte, but I can't remember. It might be a terabyte. I think it might be a terabyte. But it's not super, super expensive. But the serverless, that gets charged on demand. The dedicated, that's a per hour rate. So, if you click on it, for those of you who haven't used Azure SQL Data Warehouse, it tells you the price. You can scale up by these data warehousing units and do all that. But I'm going to discard that because I don't want that to try to scale up while I'm doing my demo. So this is what it looks like inside of Portal right here, right? But if I go to the home here and the overview, where you do kind of all your work and stuff, and is in this Azure Synapse Studio. So just as a side note, if your end users go to Portal at Azure and they click on your Synapse and they don't see Open Synapse Studio right here, it's because they haven't been granted a contributor role in this workspace. So if you give people access to Synapse Workspace and you don't give them if you forget to give them the contributor, you say, hey, go to Portal, click on Synapse Workspace, and go click Open Synapse Studio, and they don't see it, it's because they haven't been granted that contributor role right here. So once we get in the workspace, this is where we do all the where we can manage data, look at data, visualize data, all these type of different things, right? So you have On the left here, you have the home. This is where you kind of see recent, little shortcut boxes and things right there. You can create new scripts, new notebooks, new data flows, new Apache Spark jobs, new pipelines. You can see your recent resources, some links to pages. Next, you have the data. This is going to show your workspaces, so it's going to show your databases. So in this case, if I look right here, I've got one database called Meteor. This is in my on-demand pool. I have another one, which is my dedicated. So this is an Azure SQL dedicated database that I created. This is a database. So in your on-demand SQL pool, you can create databases, and they're just basically like logical databases. So if I come up here in this little plus sign here, I can create new SQL databases in my on-demand here. And when I click it, it'll say, hey, do I want a serverless or do I want dedicated? If you say dedicated, you have to go to manage pools to create it, and you do it right here. And this creates a new dedicated SQL pool. So another Azure SQL Data Warehouse. But in here, when you click SQL database, I don't know why they give you these two options. You click service, you can create multiple databases. So like I'll do that just to show you one. So I'm gonna create one called Aussie, right? And so I created that, and now you can see that show up. Notice what it doesn't see. Notice where it doesn't say tables. It has external tables, external resources, views, schemas, security. And if I look at this one, you see where it has tables. And you see the little icons. This is how I knew this is a on-demand, used to be called Azure SQL Data Warehouse. And if I look at this one, you can see this little icon here. This is the serverless, right? The serverless pools. If I come back here in portal, right here, so this is going to go to my portal page. Remember these endpoints here? So this is the dedicated, this is the formerly known as Azure SQL Data Warehouse endpoint. This one here is that serverless endpoint. This dedicated endpoint is an Azure SQL Data Warehouse type connection, and the serverless SQL endpoint, you connect to it just as if you're connecting to an Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Azure SQL Database. Just show you real quick, let me go to SSMS. So if you go to SSMS, I've already connected to both those resources. This is, so you see where it says on demand, this is the serverless pool. This is the data warehouse pool connection. So you can see right here, this little icon, you can see where I created a on-demand Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Notice the four little database clusters. So that's at that connection point there. And if you notice right here on the on-demand one, if I notice I don't see Meteor, but if I refresh my database, you should see that Aussie one I just created, right? Everybody with me so far? How did I get to those connections? Inside a portal, you go to your Azure Workspace on the overview page right there. There's how you connect to them. And just to see, I'll show you real quick. If I go to connect, I say database engine, there's a serverless. In this case, I use Azure Active Directory, Universal MFA, put my username and hit connect. It opens up a browser screen where I log in or do my MFA, hit connect, I connect. The Synapse Workspace name.sql.azuresynapse.net. This connects to the on-demand, to the Azure SQL Data Warehouse type pools. Everybody with me? So that's how that's just the data part here. Develop. This is where we go and we can do queries, right? So for example, I have a little script here. So I have a JSON file of Meteor data. I just found on the internet. And what I did is inside the data right here, I jumped to data here. I went to data, I went over here to linked. And so what these linked connection is here, these are linked to my data lakes. I'll talk about the integration data sets in a second right here. But when I go to this data lake Gen 2 here, remember when I showed you I created my workspace, I created a data lake Gen 2, and this is connected to it right here. So just inside of this Synapse here, blob, I just did an uploaded my JSON file. And just so you can see what it looks like, it just looks like this. So it's got like the name of the meteor, an ID, some other validation stuff, the class, the mass, how big was the meteor, the year it fell. We got some old ones like 1880 and 1858, right? So I have this JSON file, and I just went here and I just uploaded it into my data lake. And then I went to develop. Actually, before I went to develop, I right-clicked right here on this JSON file, and guess what it gave me? It gave me this option to say new SQL script, new notebook, new data flow, new integration data set. So I can go right with inside of the storage explorer inside the Synapse Studio and do things like create a SQL script to select top 100 rows, bulk load the data, create a notebook to load this to a Spark table or to a data frame, or create a new data flow, or hey, let's make this an integration data set so that I can go over here to integrate and build a pipeline and integrate this data in to my Synapse environment, either into the OnDemand SQL pool, to a Spark table, to another data source somewhere else. It has these hooks in there. So just to show you real quick, I'm just going to say new SQL script, select top 100 rows, and you can see it built the SQL script here called SQL script 1. Gives me some content. I'm just going to collapse that so we can see it. And so you can see where it gives us the connection to the data lake, detected as JSON, gives you some things about, hey, like use this right here to pull the keys out of this, right? So I can select what database I want to play with here. And so I can say run. And you can see where it got the JSON contents. Now, one thing I know is this is the way this data is stored. I don't need this row terminator here. So now if I run this, you notice now I get my rows here. And the reason that's the case is because in my data, I don't have a terminator on my rows. Each line is a new row, right? In this particular data. So I get my data this way. And then if I want to get like the name, I can come in here and comment this out. And then just say dot name, his name, run this, and it doesn't like something that I did. Sometimes it has this weird incorrect syntax. Oh, I know why. It doesn't know what. I didn't do that one. I didn't comment that. Oh, right here. This is what it is. That's what it is. So run that. You can see I get name, right? Everybody with me? So you see how easy that is, right? So now, that being said, you're typically not going to go to data and go to here and say upload my file. You might be if you're like a data scientist or somebody just playing with a data set you already just had a dump from. Definitely makes sense to do that. But like what I do where I work, we have real-time data that streams JSON files and also Parquet files right into this data lake in the Synapse. And then we have views built on top of that. So one thing to note, I want to show you this. When I created this new SQL script, it just gave it the name SQL script 1. I can go over here to the properties. If you don't see properties, it's this little button right here. You click it, you give it a name, and then you hit publish all, and then this will save this SQL script in the studio. I'm not going to save this script because I don't need it. Oh, and cancel, because I already have a little bit. I have this same script you just saw right here already fleshed out with some more attributes, right? So whenever I ran that JSON content, if you remember when I showed you the file, we had name, we had year, we had mass, we had the lat and long, where these meters are located. So if I select this and run this, right, you can see where I get all that data. And then the cool thing is now I can say, hey, look, I want to create a view inside of my NoSQL, my serverless SQL pool. I created it in that Meteor database. And now I have this view. So if I come back over here to see my Meteor database here, see my views here. Now I created this view. If I select the rows, I already had it open somewhere. Now you see that data, right? Now I have a view just like it's in SQL, right? Then I can do things like this. So this is Power BI. All I did was get data, and I said, get data. Went to Azure SQL database, connect. Click the wrong button. Oh, sorry, right here. Remember, this is in the serverless one. This is not this. So this is the one that's using the serverless one. That's that link right here. Oh, SQL OnDemand one. And if I go back to my Power BI, I can drop that in. I can say Meteor. I can say connect. And that view is going to show up eventually, right here. And I can transform it into it. I'm going to cancel because I already have it. But that's all I brought in there. And then you can see where that's that same view. That's reading the JSON. That is the latitude. Remember, it had latitude, longitude in there. So we can come in here, zoom into Australia, and see where all the meteor impacts are, right? And that's all from that JSON file. Now, that being said, this is just one file. But if I had multiple files with the same format, you can wildcard these and do all that, right? So, and they can search through through folders and all that kind of stuff. So you might have real-time data streaming in JSON files that's formatted in folders of like year, month, day, and then they have the JSON files, but they're in the same format. And you might just have star.star.json, and it's reading all those files. And then the nice thing about Synapse, it has things around caching it and all that, and then so that you can get this all on demand from the data lake, but just like it's a SQL database. Pretty cool. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's why I said we do the open row set stuff in Azure SQL DB at the fraction of the cost of Synapse.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the issues that we run into at Synapse is when people use that, they tend not to have much in the way of different environments. Like they end up trying to do dev and test and prod everything on the same machines, but because of the cost of the instances, and that tends to lead to some pretty dodgy development practices. So.
Yeah. But yeah, the on demand, that's a you pay per use type of thing. So it just depends on how much data and how much you have, whether it's cheaper in SQL Server or not, right? So, it's SQL Server still costs money. Synapse does as well, depending on which you're using, right? So like
actually,
I said, Synapse,
that open row set you were using too, you're saying you can actually put a wildcard in that one. I didn't realize the bulk would take
absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
If you do that. If you do that, though, is there any way to get to the name of the file from within the query?
You'd have to probably build another type of view that's just looking for the file. Right?
Yeah, it's one of the pain points at the moment, and it's the same in SQL Server, is there's no method that gives you a list of what files are in the folder.
Yeah, I haven't tried
and
that,
so,
to be honest
yeah.
with you. I haven't looked. For us, we're just kind of like looking at the data. I mean, literally, we're stringing billions of row points in from network oil and gas. We're streaming in billions of row points into these, and so we're like, there's hundreds and thousands of files. So
yeah, we often want to know the name of the file it came from.
Yeah,
and so even if you had a wildcard, you wouldn't have that, and they don't give you an option to get a list of files in a folder. So It's just bizarre. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, it might be a way just to create a view that would just do that, right? I don't know. It might be like a
No,
tricky way
I
to
haven't
do it
found any
I don't
way to
know.
do it.
Yeah, I don't know.
What we end up doing is we end up doing a get metadata thing in ADF,
Well, you
and
could
then
do it through.
and then passing a string with all the file names
Well, I'll tell you how to do it.
to
actually.
a proc in SQL. Yeah, it's a
Well,
pain
I'll
in
tell
the
you how
neck.
to do
Yeah.
it. We'll go right there. Well, I'll tell you how to do it. We won't do it just because I don't have the time to off the cuff. But so when you get we went to data, we develop, we looked at SQL scripts for on-demand, but you also have notebooks, right? So you can do notebooks inside Apache Spark. So one of the things you could do is you could use Apache Spark and read your data lake, and then it could read the files for you and create you a Spark table that way with the name of your files.
Yeah. Oh, look,
So
ADF does a job fine.
Yeah.
I just wish there was a way of doing it from within SQL. Yeah. So it seems really dumb to be able to read files but not find out what files are there.
Files there are, yeah. I know what you mean. So one thing, so if we'll stay on the Meteor JSON. If you look right here, I created this little like PySpark. So one thing inside of manage and your pools. So here I said new, I created my dedicated SQL pool. This is formerly what's called Azure SQL Data Warehouse. This is this massively parallel processing engine that has like 60 nodes behind it. I created that, but then I also came to Apache Spark pool, created a new one called Syn Spark, just said new, in this case, because it's my money and my subscription. But technically it's Microsoft's money through my MVP subscription, but I only get so much a month and I don't want to waste it. So I just did a small, estimated to be $1.84 to $630 a US dollar, $1.84 to $6 and some change US dollars per hour. Gave it a name. You got some additional settings and different things you can do around pausing things, right? And then I created my Spark pool. So this is how the on-demand pool that's created when you create the workspace. The SQL pool, the Apache Spark pool, you got to do that here. So I go back to develop. I created the Spark pool. One thing, this little line of code right here, we go back to data, Synapse here. This little line of code here is when I right-clicked here, I just said new notebook, load a data frame, right? But then, just to give you an example, I'm not going to run these just from a time standpoint, but just to show you that you have inside of this Synapse, you have the ability to run notebooks, similar like Jupyter notebooks. You can see the output here. Sorry, what's funny is you guys can see my second screen, but I couldn't for a second. It went blank on me. It was still showing. But you can just, the idea here is inside of Synapse Analytics, you can run Apache Spark through these Apache Spark pools. And here's some examples of some code. I tried to use the demo Microsoft has out there. It failed. For some reason, when you go try to read the Parquet file now, it doesn't like it. So I just went to the Azure ML Open Data Sets, imported the data, grabbed like a month or so, about 20 days of data, brought it into a Spark data frame, printed out the schema. I can actually create a database inside of here. So you can see this NYC database right here, this workspace. So that's this NYC taxi data. There's my Spark table right here. And then, so I created this database, and then I wrote a table NYC trips out here. And then down here, I just did a simple query and wrote out the passenger counts, right? So these are the Spark tables. Just to show you that inside of the Synapse Analytics, you have this capability of doing Apache Spark, right? But for time's sake, I'm not going to run these because it just takes a few minutes to run because I have such a small Spark pool. And then one thing to note is when you're in these things, you can attach to your different pools. So everybody with me? So that's the develop tab. So notebooks, scripts, flows. So what I want to show you now is the integration pipelines. So I built out this pipeline, and it's just one copy activity. And what this copy activity is it grabs from my SQL Server on-premise, meaning my SQL Server on my laptop. It grabs this table here called Wellmaster. So if I select these top rows, so the idea here being you use these pipelines to load your data warehouse, right? Or you can load whatever, right? You can use the pipelines to load your data lake. You can use the pipelines to load to other data sources. You can do the pipeline to load data in data lake and then call Spark jobs and do whatever, right? But it's an integration tool. In this case, I'm just showing you how you can bring on-premise data into Azure Synapse Analytics, right? So in this case, I'm going to bring this well master table in here. So that's my source. My sink, we went right to that's that SQL OnDemand pool, formerly Azure SQL Data Warehouse, it used to be called. Now it's called SQL OnDemand Pools. I'm going to write this. I'm going to write it via Polybase. See that right here? I'm going to use Polybase to do it. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, Greg, at the first part about people writing to files. Because I'm using Polybase, I have to stage it. So I'm going to click Enable Staging. I selected my default Synapse storage that's connected to my Synapse Analytics here. I created a storage path underneath there called Pipeline Staging. Where did I do that? I just went to Data. I went to Linked, Synapse. Inside this Synapse folder, I just created a folder called Pipeline Staging. Give me 1 second. I'm going to close a few tabs up here so you guys can see. So that's what this copy activity did. Now, there's some stuff I had to do to make this work, right? So I have a source. This source has a data set. This data set has a linked service. Same with this sync. Has a data set. This data set has a linked service. So I had to create some linked services. Well, where do I do that? I do that under the manage. Now, one thing to note is I said I'm going to do my local database on my SQL Server on my box. Well, that's an on-premise source. That's literally my laptop sitting in my house right now. So to do that, I have to create an integration runtime so that I can connect to my on-premises databases. So when you go and you click these integration runtimes under manage right here, you're going to see the first time you do it, you're just going to see this auto resolve integration runtime. This is by default there. And what this is the Azure by default integration runtime so that Azure can communicate to other Azure resources. So it creates this one so that you can use that. But since I'm communicating to a SQL Server developer edition, in this case, on my laptop, I have to use a self-hosted environment to do that, a self-hosted integration runtime to do that. Well, how do I do that? It's real simple. You click the new button, you say self-hosted, you say continue, you give it a name, Aussie runtime, you say create. It's actually very simple. Now, one thing I haven't talked about is private endpoints and all that. That's a little beyond intro, right? Where if you're getting into private networking, we're all still using public networking and all that. So now the integration is inside of my Synapse, and then I have these keys that I use to link my integration runtime. So use this link to download it, you run it, and when you run it, this is why I kept my PowerPoint up right here. When you run it, if it gets to the end, when you run it, you just do next, next, next. You get to the end, it says, hey, register this integration runtime. You're going to drop the key right here, say register. And that key is what this key right here, and you get two of them, you can use either one. I just use the key one. You register it, you drop it in, when you hit register, now it's going to register this runtime into Azure. Notice, because I didn't run it and register this one, you can see where it's unavailable, right? And I did that on purpose because I didn't need it. So I'm going to hit delete there. But once you register it, it'll go to another screen where it says, hey, this is the name of the integration runtime. It'll be the name of your machine. In this case, my machine is called Stat Cowboy XPS because that's my machine. And then another option will say, hey, do you want to create a backup file? Please create a backup file. That way, if your self-hosted runtime gets messed up or something, you can reinstall, point it to the backup file, give it the password you gave it, and you create a backup file and redo everything. So now I've got this integration runtime defined. Notice right here, this is telling me that I have one linked data set associated to this runtime. In this case, it's my SQL Server. Once I have my integration runtime, I can create my linked services. These are my external connections. So in this case, in my demo, I'm coming from my Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. This is that SQL data. This is the data warehouse. So to create this, I just go, link service. I say new, gives me this little link here. So in this case, this is Azure Synapse Analytics. So I just type send to get there. I hit continue. I give it a name, Aussie Data Warehouse. Notice the runtime. Notice they got this is the self-host one we just did. This is an Azure resource. So I just use my auto resolve one. I select my subscription. It already detected that I have, in this case, since I only have one Synapse Workspace, it grabbed it. It detected I only have one database, dedicated SQL pool database, so it grabbed it. I can do SQL authentication. In this case, I can do manage identity. And what this is doing, because I have access to Synapse, because Synapse has that manage identity that I showed you, that's the same name as the Synapse Workspace, that's connected to be able to connect to this resource. So you can see I just did test. It's successful, and I would hit create. I'm not going to do that because I've already done it over here. And just to show you, so that's the link to the data warehouse. That's the sink where I'm going to write to. And since I'm going to use an on-premise SQL server, I just do SQL. I don't use Azure SQL. This is my on-premise. I say SQL server. I give it a name, that cowboy demo, right? Can't have underscores. So demo, in this case, I have to say auto runtime. I give it the server name. I give it the database name. I can say Windows authentication. Test it, or you can do data. You can use this. If you have SQL Server authentication, it works as well, right? Connection successful. I would hit create, and it would create that connection. So now I have a connection to. That's the link services, right? And that gives me my connection to the databases. In this case, the Azure SQL, the Azure dedicated SQL pool, which is that data warehouse inside of Synapse, and my on-premise SQL server. And now if I come back to integration and my pipeline here, I can create a new pipeline. So the way I create a new pipeline is to say new pipeline. I click new pipeline. I come to my activities, and I can drag in what I want and do all that. I'm going to close that out because I've already did it. But that's how I got the pipeline started and this copy activity started. So now I have my source, but this is going to a data set that we just did the link services. So you have options here. I can click new, create a new data set, or if I come back over here to data, right here, I can go to link. And if you're right here, I said I was going to come back to integration data sets. I can create a new integration data set. And so in this case, I just say new integration data set. I type Synapse again. In this case, I select dedicated SQL pool because that's what I'm going to. And then, I can give it a name, hit OK. That creates my data set to my data. There's things you can do around parameters and all that. What I can do, but that would be the connection to my data set. One thing I forgot to show you is I already pre-created my table with this code. And all I did was just grab the syntax of my table on premise. And since this is a Azure dedicated SQL pool, which is the formerly Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and the MPP, it requires this with statement to say, hey, is it a cluster column store index? Are we using heap? Little beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but I created that table there. So that goes to that data set. And then, like I said, I created this one to SQL Server. So I just picked the link service. So let me just show you real quick how I did that. So then I just said SQL Server, create. I select the link service, give it a name. It loads the table. In this case, I'm going to source it from this well master. And then I can say, hit OK, right? And that's going to create my integration data set. I'm going to cancel. So now I have my two integration data sets. If I go back to my integration point here, my pipeline, I did the new pipeline. I dropped my copy activity. Now I can select those two data sources. My source is the SQL Server on premise. My sink is the it's dedicated SQL pool. I click Polybase. One thing I did down here is, this is not good practice. You know, technically you're not going to truncate your table and then load the data. This is a demo. The way I do it in production, just so you know, is I use staging tables. And so I have a schema with this STG on the end of the schema name, which is my staging schema. And then I have a table with underscore staging at the end of it. That's my staging table. I would truncate that staging table, load the data in that staging table, and then I have a T-SQL package that I call. It's just another call. I can't remember, it's under general. So then I can just say store procedure, right? And then I would drag the store procedure over like that. And then it calls this store procedure that knows how to swap the tables, or if I'm using partitioning, it knows how to swap the partitioning. But this is just a demo. So in this case, I'm just going to say, take my source, copy it over into my source, truncate the data table before I do it, so that I don't just get, invalid entries because there's duplicates. And so now my pipeline's running. And so if I just run it, you can see right here where it's running it. You can see where it's queued. And then you can also, it looks just like, for those of you know ADF, you can add a trigger. That trigger will come under manage. So now it's in progress. So you can see it succeeded, copied the 100 rows. And if I come over here to my, here, and my SSMS, this is my connection to the SQL, dedicated SQL pool. You can tell by the little cluster icon here. You can see my table here. If I select my rows, you can see my data is there. If I go to Power BI, go to Power BI, not SQL Server. I say get data. I go, it's already connected, it's right there. But I say Azure. In this case, I say Azure Synapse Analytics SQL Data Warehouse. Connect. I drop in that server name. Where do I get that from? You go back to the portal, to your workspace. It's the dedicated SQL endpoint right here. Right. This is for the dedicated SQL pool. You drop that name in there. You can put the database to connect, and then there's that data, right? So you can see how that data can be read from an Azure Synapse. One thing I didn't show you is inside of here, if I were to trigger this right here, the last tab I didn't show you is the monitor. You can see that pipeline running here, right? Also, you can see your SQL pools, your Apache pools, so any kind of jobs, that is all under this monitor tab. And then finally, one thing I talked about earlier is you have the ability to connect to Purview. So if you have a Purview account, you connect it right here. Also, access control. So remember I told you had Azure rollback security where you need to grant people contributor at the Azure level right here. But then once you grant a person contributor, then they have to be granted a role inside of Synapse, whether it be a Synapse SQL administrator, a Synapse administrator, which is like the highest level, whether it's contributor, meaning I can read and write data inside of Synapse, or some of these other ones. We won't talk about them. But the other thing I want to talk about is workspace items. So you can actually grant people access to integration runtime. So if you want to, you can actually get down to the level where you're controlling who can see the pipeline, the run times, or the link services, or the credentials, so that you can it gives you a lot of granularity around who you can grant access to this workspace. And why I say that is because you can actually set up a workspace for your company and give corporate access to the right type of people. And so you have people who are just going to hit the pools, the SQL pools, and they can see the data. But then you're going to have like advanced analysts or advanced data scientists who might have access into this Synapse workspace to go and do the things like the data, the develop, and all that. One thing to notice it says I have a publish right here. I don't want to publish that. I'm going to cancel. And how do I get rid of this right here? If I click right up here in this top right, I can discard my changes and it goes away. And then there's some other stuff around here. And I think that's about it. Any questions?
Feel free to take yourself off of mute and ask a question or put your hand up.
Sorry, I went over 10 minutes. But
That's
I just
okay.
kind of wanted to give you guys a whole kind of preview of all that's there. And then while y'all are asking questions, I'll put this up. So if you want to take a screenshot of that, I mean, I haven't had a chance, but I'll go to my GitHub right here, and I'll put the slide deck and up there.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Did it make sense?
That's the big thing. Well, hang on. So we've got some comments coming through. Great session, Jamie. All right. So thank you, Jamie, for spending the time and presenting for us. Thank you, everybody, for being part of the session. As mentioned at the start, this has been recorded, and once it's been processed, it'll be placed up onto the YouTube channel. We haven't got any meetings lined up as yet, but I have got some sessions that I just need to finalize so that we will then start continuing again in July for the second half of the year. If you do want to present, now's the time to shoot me an email, and we can look at locking you in for a scheduled slot. So with that, if nobody has any other questions, once again, thank you. Thank you, Jamie. Everybody stay safe, enjoy, and we'll see you all at the next session next month.
All right, thanks, everyone.